It was a small wooden box, no bigger than a paperback, locked with a rusted padlock that had belonged to my husband, and the note inside it was only 16 words long. 16 words, written in his tight, careful hand on the back of an old gas station receipt that would sit in my chest like a dormant infection for 7 years, until the morning I stood on the porch of a 4-bedroom colonial with a writ of foreclosure in my handbag. Looking at the front door, my son had painted pale grey because his wife said it looked more modern for Instagram. I was not bitter, not in that moment. I was simply done, and the house I was about to take possession of would become a fully booked vacation rental that now funds my retirement and will keep funding it until I decide to stop breathing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a mother's kindness is not an invitation to be robbed blind. My name is Lori Massey, and for 32 years I was a payroll clerk for the Pima County Unified School District in Tucson, Arizona. It was not a glamorous job, but I was good at it, the kind of good that meant the auditors never had to ask me to pull a duplicate report, because my first one already had every column footed and cross-checked. I processed compensation for over 7,000 employees. I knew the tax withholding tables for married filing jointly and head of household, the way some women know the exact shade of their favorite lipstick, and I could spot a discrepancy of 9 cents on a W-2 from across a room. My cubicle had a little sign taped to the monitor that said, "Trust but verify," and I lived by that rule every working day. I was the person the other clerks called when a teacher's direct deposit failed or a bus driver's pension contribution looked off, and I would spend hours tracing the glitch until the numbers balanced. I loved that work. It gave me a sense of order in a world that rarely made sense otherwise. My husband Mike used to joke that I was the only person he knew who could reconcile a petty cash drawer while holding a conversation about what to have for dinner. Mike was a diesel mechanic, 3rd generation, the kind of man whose hands were permanently stained with a mixture of 15W40 and honest sweat, and he smelled permanently of Gojo hand cleaner and the faint metallic tang of a toolbox that had seen 3 decades of shop floors. He worked in a heavy truck repair shop that was a cavern of grease pits and pneumatic wrenches, and he could diagnose an engine knock by resting a long screwdriver against the block and putting his ear to the handle like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. He taught me that everything mechanical had a logic to it, a sequence of cause and effect that could be understood and fixed if you were patient enough to learn. On rainy weekends when the shop was closed, he would bring home old pin tumbler padlocks from the junk drawer and show me how to pick them. He had a set of thin steel picks he had made from hacksaw blades, each one bent to a precise angle, and he would sit with me at the kitchen table and explain how the spring-loaded driver pins and key pins lined up along the shear line. "You just need a light touch, Lori," he would say, his voice a rumble of concentration. "Too much tension and you'll overset, too little and you'll never get the plug to turn. The lock will tell you when you've got it right, you just have to listen." I never thought I would need that skill. I was a payroll clerk, not a safecracker, but I loved the way his mind worked, and I loved that he wanted to share that part of himself with me. We met at a Denny's in 1982 when I stole his last ranch dressing packet because the waitress forgot mine, and he just laughed and said, "Take it, I'm more of a blue cheese man anyway." 2 years later, we were married in a little chapel outside Bisbee with 23 guests and a potluck reception that cost us less than $600. We lived our entire marriage in a 1,000-square-foot ranch house with a carport instead of a garage, a swamp cooler instead of central air, and a kitchen that still had the original 1972 avocado green countertops. We never carried credit card debt. We never bought a new car. Mike drove the same 1991 Ford F-150 for 21 years, and when the transmission finally gave out at 312,000 miles, he rebuilt it himself over 6 weekends on the concrete slab behind the carport, using a borrowed transmission jack, and a lot of words I will not repeat here. I kept a meticulous budget in a spiral notebook with blue graph paper, and every month we sat down at the kitchen table and went over it line by line. We saved for retirement like squirrels facing a long winter, and we celebrated our anniversary by going to the same modest Mexican restaurant and ordering the same combination plates. It was not exciting, but it was solid. It was a life built on the principle that security was a form of love. We had exactly 1 child, a son named Jason, born in 1990, and from the moment that boy could talk he had a kind of easy charm that made people want to hand him things. Teachers gave him extra credit without him asking for it. Friends' parents let him stay for dinner. Girls at his high school wrote his initials inside hearts on the covers of their notebooks, and I am not saying any of this was his fault. He was a sweet kid with a smile that could light up a room and a fundamental inability to understand that the universe did not owe him a comfortable life just because he existed in it. I can still remember him at 7 years old, sitting at this very kitchen table with a math workbook, and when he got a problem wrong he would look at me with those big brown eyes and say, "But I thought it would just work out." That was Jason's philosophy in miniature, the belief that things would just work out, that someone would always be there to catch the ball he dropped. Mike saw it before I did. Mike would say things like, "That boy needs to learn how to bleed before he learns how to spend," but I was his mother, and I could not hear the warning underneath the words. I wanted to believe that charm and a good heart would carry him through, and I ignored the signs that the heart was not as good as I hoped. There was the time in middle school when he sold his classmate's bike for $50 because the kid owed him a favor. There was the time in high school when he took my car without asking and crashed it into a ditch, then told the insurance company it had been stolen. I covered for him. I always covered for him because that is what mothers do, and because I told myself that every child made mistakes. By the time he was 25, he had held 7 different jobs and left each one under a cloud of vague excuses about bad bosses and unfair expectations. He met Kelly at a mall kiosk where he was selling cell phone cases, and she was a newly licensed real estate agent who saw in him a man she could shape. I did not like her from the first dinner. She asked me what my brand was, and I told her I did not have a brand, I had a pension. She laughed like I had made a joke, but her eyes did not crinkle. Mike told me later that night, "That woman is a chipper shark in lipstick. Watch yourself." I thought he was being dramatic. Mike died on a Tuesday in late October 2018, 3 weeks after they found the tumor wrapped around his left bronchus like a strangler fig. The diagnosis had come out of nowhere. He had been tired, just tired, and then one morning he could not catch his breath and we went to the emergency room and the CT scan showed a mass the size of a golf ball sitting exactly where the airway branches. The oncologist was kind but direct. There were treatments, but the odds were brutally low and the quality of life in the months remaining would be almost non-existent. Mike chose to stop, and I sat beside him while he made that choice, holding his grease-stained hand and feeling the calluses that had been worn smooth from a lifetime of gripping tools. I did not leave his bedside for the last 48 hours, except to use the restroom and once to drink a cup of watery hospital coffee that I immediately threw back up because my stomach had stopped accepting anything but grief. When he was gone, I felt like someone had hollowed me out with a spoon and filled the cavity with static. The funeral was a blur of faces and handshakes and casseroles wrapped in foil. I remember standing at the graveside in a black dress that had been hanging untouched in my closet for 15 years, watching the polished wood of his coffin lower into the dry Arizona earth, and thinking that half of me was going down with him. Jason stood beside me in a suit he had borrowed from a friend, his arm loosely around my shoulders in a gesture that felt rehearsed. Kelly was there in a black dress that looked like it cost more than my monthly pension check, which I later discovered it did. She was holding a small leather clutch and dabbing at the corner of her eye with a tissue in a way that was precise and deliberate, like she was marking a box on an emotional to-do list. Kelly was a real estate agent, a thin blonde woman with a 1,000-watt smile, and a belief that personal branding was a legitimate form of emotional expression. She documented their lives on social media with the ferocity of a small business owner who believed that if she just posted enough photos of charcuterie boards and sunset yoga poses, the algorithm would finally reward her with the closing commission that would change everything. I had always been polite to her because I was raised to be polite, but I had never once been comfortable in a room alone with her because she looked at me the way a home inspector looks at a cracked foundation, like I was an expense she had already calculated into her future renovation budget. At the funeral reception, she cornered me by the punch bowl and asked whether Mike had left any life insurance policies that she and Jason should be aware of, just to be organized. I told her there was a small policy through the mechanics union, enough to cover the funeral and a little cushion, and I watched her eyes flicker with the briefest flash of disappointment before she rearranged her face into a sympathetic mask. The day after the funeral, before I had even had a chance to wash the last of the casserole dishes that had been dropped off by well-meaning neighbors, Jason and Kelly appeared at my front door at 9 in the morning with 2 large cardboard boxes and an energy that felt like a sales pitch wearing a sympathy card. Kelly immediately started buzzing through the living room, picking up framed photographs and knickknacks, making little comments like, "Oh, this doesn't really spark joy anymore, does it, Mom?" And I was too stunned and too hollowed out to tell her to put down my things. She picked up the ceramic owl my mother had painted in 1964 and dropped it into a donation box with a clatter that made me flinch. Jason hovered in the kitchen doorway, hands in his pockets, offering to take care of the estate stuff, so I wouldn't have to worry my pretty head about it. I remember thinking, my pretty head, he has never used those words in his life. Kelly must have coached him on the drive over. They worked their way through the house in a single afternoon, bagging up what they called clutter and I called my life, and around 3 o'clock they descended on Mike's workshop. The workshop was a converted back porch filled with his tools, his parts bins, his grease-stained repair manuals with their covers curled and softened from years of handling, and the particular smell of a man who had spent 40 years fixing things with his bare hands. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cold mug of coffee, while I heard the thump and clatter of them tossing things into donation boxes and trash bags. The sound of a heavy socket wrench hitting the bottom of a plastic bin made me wince, and I wanted to run in there and scream at them to stop, but my body would not move. Grief can do that. It can make you a passenger in your own life while other people take the wheel and drive you off a cliff. At some point, Kelly came back into the kitchen holding a small wooden box, about the size of a tissue box, with a rusted steel padlock hanging from its hasp. It was plain, unfinished pine, the kind of box a kid might make in a high school woodshop class, and I recognized it immediately. Mike had kept it on the top shelf of his workbench for as long as I could remember, tucked behind a row of coffee cans filled with screws and washers. I had never asked what was inside because he had never volunteered, and that was part of the quiet contract of our marriage. Some things were private, not because they were secrets but because they were personal, and we trusted each other enough to leave those spaces undisturbed. Kelly held it out at arm's length between two fingers like it was a dirty diaper. "This is just junk, right?" she said, and before I could answer, she tossed it into the kitchen trash can with a little flick of her wrist and went back to the workshop. The box landed with a soft thud on a bed of coffee grounds and eggshells, and I stared at it for a long moment while the sound of their graceless rummaging continued in the back. Then something rose up in me, a flicker of the woman I used to be before the harlowing, and I got up. I pulled the box out of the trash, wiped it off with a paper towel, and carried it to my bedroom closet. I tucked it under a stack of old photo albums out of sight. That night after Jason and Kelly had gone back to their rented condo, I sat on the edge of my bed and turned the box over in my hands. The pine was rough, the grain darkened with age and the faint ghost of Mike's oily fingerprints. The padlock was a small master lock, 4-pin tumblers, nothing fancy, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. Mike had taught me how to pick a lock years ago, not because I ever thought I would need the skill, but because he liked to show me how things worked, and we had once spent a rainy Saturday afternoon in his workshop with a set of old pin tumbler locks, and a pair of hook picks he had made from hacksaw blades. I still kept a small leather case with those picks in the back of my nightstand drawer, because I was sentimental and because I had never forgotten the feel of the pins setting one by one under the tension of the torque wrench, that little tick that told you were getting closer. I fetched the leather case, opened it on the bed, and selected a medium hook pick and a thin tension wrench. The lock was stiff with rust, and the first pin stuck a little before it slid up. I applied a steady, light rotational pressure with the wrench, just enough to bind the plug, and I worked my way through the pin stack one click at a time. The familiar quiet focus settled over me, the same focus I used to use when balancing a payroll ledger at year-end, when the numbers were not adding up. After about 4 minutes, the last driver pin cleared the shear line, and the plug turned with a satisfying little snick. The hasp popped open. Inside the box, there was a collection of small things that clearly had meant something only to Mike. An old silver dollar his father had given him when he turned 10, worn smooth from decades of being carried in a pocket. A tiny polished stone we had picked up on a beach in Mexico during our only real vacation, the one where we slept in a tent and ate fresh mangoes and talked about what we would do when we were too old to work. A folded strip of photo booth pictures from our first anniversary, 4 images of us making silly faces, my hair big and permed, his mustache thick and dark. And at the bottom, a square of paper torn from a small spiral notepad, the kind he used to jot down parts numbers while working on a transmission. I unfolded the paper and there was his handwriting, the same neat block letters he used when he was riding on work orders. It said, "Laurie, if I'm gone, trust your own head, not Jason's. He has a sickness for easy money. Don't let him near the pension. I saw the rot, save yourself." I read it 6 times. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the indentations the pen had left in the paper, and I cried in a way I had not cried since the moment the oncologist had said the word terminal. Then I folded it back up, put it in my own jewelry box, and did not think about it again for nearly a year, because that is what mothers do when the evidence says their child is a danger, and their heart says that cannot possibly be true. 4 months after the funeral, Jason and Kelly came to me with a proposal. They had found a duplex in a nice part of town that was going on the market, a solid brick property from the 1950s with a 2-bedroom unit on each side, and a shared courtyard with an old grapefruit tree. The building had good bones, they said, and it was in an up-and-coming neighborhood where property values were starting to climb. They wanted to start a family, they told me, and they needed a stable place to live. They couldn't qualify for a mortgage on their own because Kelly's real estate income was irregular, commissions ebbing and flowing with the market, and Jason had been let go from his sales job at a medical supply company after a dispute over an expense account. They sat me down at their kitchen table, which was a cheap glass-topped thing from a big box store, and they laid out their plan with the careful choreography of a real estate pitch. Kelly did most of the talking, her voice soft and earnest, her eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that felt like a laser beam. Jason sat beside her, nodding along, occasionally reaching over to pat my hand. They promised with both hands on my shoulders and tears welling in Kelly's eyes, that if I used part of my pension to buy the duplex in my name, they would rent the larger unit from me at a fair market rate, pay every month on time, build their credit, and then within 3 years they would get a mortgage of their own and buy the whole property from me. The purchase price would give me a nice profit, they said, and I could live securely in the smaller unit without ever having to worry about housing costs again. Kelly had even run the numbers on a spreadsheet, projecting a $55,000 return on my investment plus 3 years of steady rental income. She showed me the spreadsheet with its color-coded cells and tidy formulas, and it looked convincing. It looked like a plan a smart retiree might make. It was, objectively, a terrible financial idea. I knew it was a terrible financial idea, the way a payroll clerk knows that an employee who claims 17 allowances on a W-4 is trying to game the system. My pension was my only significant asset. I had worked 32 years to accumulate $175,000 in that fund, and liquidating it early meant I would take a massive penalty and a tax bomb that would eat into the principal immediately. I also knew that I would be giving up my only source of guaranteed monthly income, the steady check that had replaced my paycheck and would support me until I died. I lay awake at night thinking about it, staring at the ceiling, hearing Mike's voice in my head saying, "Trust your own head, not Jason's." But I was a widow, and I was lonely, and I wanted so desperately to believe that my son had grown up. I wanted to believe that the sweet boy who used to bring me dandelions in a Dixie cup was still in there, that I could give him a leg up and he would do right by me. I told myself that Kelly's spreadsheet proved good faith. I told myself that this was a chance to help launch my son into stable adulthood while securing my own housing. I told myself a lot of things, and I knew deep down that I was lying to myself, but the alternative was to admit that my own child, the person I had carried and raised and loved with every fiber of my being, might be capable of hurting me. That was a truth I could not face. So against every screaming instinct in my head, against the 16 words in Mike's note, I gave them the pen. I cashed out the entire pension, paid the taxes and the penalties with a portion of it, and used the remainder, plus a little of my savings, to buy the duplex for $210,000. I took the smaller 1-bedroom unit on the left side, and Jason and Kelly took the 2-bedroom unit on the right. I drew up a formal lease agreement using a template I found online, and I added a separate purchase option agreement that I wrote myself, using the contract review skills I had picked up from decades of reading collective bargaining agreements and employee handbook addenda. I made sure the document specified that the purchase option could only be exercised after 3 years of consistent on-time payments, and that the purchase price would be $230,000. They signed both, they were my tenants. They were going to pay me $900 a month, and eventually they were going to buy the whole property. On paper, it looked fine. On paper, I was a savvy retiree with a passive income stream. In real life, I had handed my entire future to a man and a woman who had already thrown away my memories without asking. For the first 6 months, they paid the rent. It was always a few days late, always with a little sigh and an apology about how things were tight, but they paid. Kelly got pregnant in month 4, which filled me with a complicated mix of joy and dread I could not fully separate. I bought a little stuffed bear and a set of soft yellow onesies, and left them on their doorstep, and Kelly posted a photo of the gift on Instagram with a caption about generous family. Jason started a new job installing home theater systems, and for a little while it felt like maybe Mike's warning had been a product of his lifelong skepticism about other people's intentions. Maybe the rot he had seen was just my own anxiety reflecting back at me. But then the rent stopped altogether. It was a Wednesday in August when I knocked on their unit door with a casserole and a gentle reminder. Kelly answered with swollen eyes and a long, quivering story about how Jason's employer had folded with no notice and no severance. The company had been cutting corners, she said, and they had let go half the workforce overnight. Could I please just give them a month or two to catch up? I said yes. I always said yes. That is what I had been trained to do by a lifetime of being the person who quietly absorbed the financial sharks so that everyone else could stay comfortable. By the time the leaves started falling, they owed me 3 months of rent, and I had burned through half of my remaining savings just keeping the utilities on and buying groceries. I started to feel a deep, cold pressure in my chest whenever I heard their car pull into the driveway. I started checking my bank account balance 3 times a day, hoping that somehow a deposit would appear that I had not initiated. It never did. Then, on a morning in late January, Kelly showed up at my front door holding a slim stack of papers and a pen with a pink fuzzy pom-pom on the end of it. She was smiling that smile, the one that made me feel like a little old lady who did not understand modern financial instruments. "Mom, we found a great way to refinance the duplex," she said, her voice bright and professional. "It'll lower the interest rate and free up some cash so we can get back on track with the rent. We just need your signature on these documents, it's super routine." She pushed the papers toward me, and I took them with the same careful grip I had always used when an employee came to payroll with a questionable expense report. I said, "Let me look these over, sweetheart, I'll get them back to you tomorrow." Her smile tightened at the corners just for a split second, but she nodded and walked back across the courtyard. I sat at my kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and spread the pages out in front of me. There was a stack of mortgage refinancing applications, a uniform residential loan application form, a thick pile of income verification sheets that seemed to show Jason's new job income at oddly inflated levels, and tucked behind them, a blank quitclaim deed form. It was unsigned, but the legal description of the duplex was already filled in, the parcel number and lot boundaries typed in neat lines. The word quitclaim hit me like a slap because I knew exactly what a quitclaim deed was. In my years as a payroll clerk, I had occasionally helped employees who were dealing with property issues, and I had learned that a quitclaim was a way to transfer ownership of property with no warranty of title. It was a quick and dirty method often used to shift assets between family members, and it was absolutely not a normal part of a refinancing process. There was no reason, none, for a quitclaim to be in this stack. If the banks were truly refinancing, they would use a standard deed of trust. My hands were shaking as I set the papers aside and picked up my phone. I called the county recorder's office from my landline, using a number I had memorized from years of verifying property tax payments, and I asked a very patient clerk named Dolores whether any quitclaim deeds had recently been recorded for my parcel number. I gave her the parcel ID, and I heard the click of her keyboard as she searched. The answer came back in less than 30 seconds. Yes, a quitclaim deed was recorded 4 days ago, transferring title from Laurie Massey to Jason and Kelly Hennessy. The clerk offered to send me a copy, and I gave her my email address. I hung up the phone, sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the avocado green cabinets, and screamed into a dish towel until my throat hurt. I did not confront them. A younger Laurie, a Laurie who had not spent 3 decades being told she was too emotional and too dramatic, might have stormed across the courtyard and banged on their door until the neighbors called the police. But 32 years of payroll had taught me that the moment you confront someone before you have the evidence locked down is the moment they start shredding documents and painting you as a confused old woman. I crawled to my feet, splashed cold water on my face, and opened the utility drawer where I kept my tools. I pulled out my little Fujitsu Scan Snap portable scanner, a device I had bought years ago to back up every important piece of paper I ever owned. I made high-resolution color scans of every page in that stack, including the blank quitclaim form, the income sheets, and the refinancing application. I scanned the notary acknowledgement page that had been tucked in the back, which bore the stamp and signature of a notary named Deborah Lynch. I stored all the scans on a password-protected USB drive that I clipped onto a lanyard and hung around my neck, under my blouse. Then I emailed a copy of everything to myself, to a backup account, and to the cloud storage I had set up for important records. I covered my tracks by deleting the sent emails from my sent folder, and I put the physical documents back in the envelope exactly as they had been. When Kelly returned the next day, all sugar sweet, and did you get a chance to sign, I told her I was still reviewing, that my head was foggy lately, that maybe I was just tired from the stress of everything. I leaned into the role of the confused, compliant older woman. I said, I just can't think straight these days. My vision gets blurry. Let me rest a little and I'll get to it. She looked at me with something that was almost pity, but it was the pity of a person who sees an obstacle being very slowly removed from a path. Take your time, Mom, she said, and I heard the real words underneath the lie. Don't take too long. A week after that, a white Ford Transit pulled up to the duplex, and a crew of 3 men started loading Jason and Kelly's furniture into it. I stood in my doorway in the early morning light and watched them carry out the glass-topped table, the sectional couch Kelly had bought on credit, and the large flat-screen television that I had noticed they were always making payments on. Jason came over to my door with a look on his face that I had not seen since he was 17 and had taken my car without asking. It was shame, but it was the kind of shame that was already hardening into defensiveness. He would not meet my eyes. We found someone who wants to buy the duplex, he said, the words tumbling out quickly as if speed could make them less true. We had to move fast. It's done, Mom. The paperwork is already through. You'll need to be out by the end of the month. The paperwork, I knew, was the quitclaim I had never signed. They had forged my signature, probably by tracing it from one of the birthday cards I had given Jason over the years. They had sold the building to a real estate investor for $200,000, pocketing every cent and leaving me with nothing. They had not paid me a cent of the purchase price, they had not honored the lease, they had not left a forwarding address. They just vanished into a rental truck and a future I had funded, and I was left standing in the courtyard with a grapefruit tree dropping its winter fruit onto the pavement and a pile of my own shattered trust. I moved into a rental studio apartment across town, a place with thin walls and a shared laundry room that ate my quarters, and I started putting my life back together the only way I knew how, which was by methodically and obsessively documenting everything. I filed a police report, but the detective assigned to my case told me that without physical evidence of the forgery, it was a civil matter, not a criminal one, and that I should get a lawyer. I called 7 lawyers. 6 of them told me it would be an uphill battle because Jason and Kelly had fled the state, and the cost of hunting them down would exceed what I could hope to recover. The 7th, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who specialized in elder financial abuse cases, invited me to her office, a small storefront with a dusty ficus and walls lined with law books. She was a stout Nigerian-American woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense haircut and a voice that could cut through steel. She listened to my whole story without interrupting, and when I was finished she leaned forward and said very quietly, "I'll help you, but first we need to find them, and that might take years." I agreed. I wrote her a check for the initial retainer using the last of my savings, and I walked out of her office with a thin folder of forms and a feeling I had not felt since Mike died: purpose. I took a series of temp jobs: data entry, bookkeeping, overnight stockroom work at a big box store, anything that would keep a roof over my head and a monthly check clearing in my account. I lived on ramen and oatmeal and the occasional rotisserie chicken that I could stretch across 4 days of meals. I took nothing that I did not need. Every month I did my budget on the same kind of blue graph paper I had used during my marriage, and every month I transferred whatever was left into a separate savings account I labeled Recovery Fund. I knew that recovering the money would require not just legal fees, but also the ability to stay afloat while the slow machine of justice turned. The first year passed, then a second. The fund grew to 5,000, then 10,000, then 15. I was relentless, and the hunger that drove me was not just for money, it was for dignity. I had spent 3 decades being invisible, the quiet woman who made the numbers balance so that the world could keep turning. I had let myself be erased. Now I was going to become undeniable. 5 years after the duplex theft, I was 59 years old, 40 pounds lighter than I had been on the day Mike died, my hair gone a soft silver grey that I kept cropped short because I could no longer be bothered with maintenance. I had legally changed my name back to my maiden name, Laughlin, and I had moved into a tiny efficiency in a senior living complex where the rent was pegged to my income. The recovery fund had grown to just over $22,000, every cent of which I was prepared to spend on destroying the people who had stolen my future. I hired a private investigator, a retired Pima County Sheriff's detective named Frank Morneau. Frank was 72 years old and walked with a cane that had a brass eagle head for a handle, but he still had the sharpest eye for public records I had ever seen. He had wispy white hair and a voice like gravel rolling downhill, and he worked out of a converted garage behind his house, where the walls were covered with maps and printouts of property records. I sat in his office one afternoon, a cup of terrible instant coffee in my hand, and told him everything. He nodded slowly, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I was finished he said, "People who run like that always leave a trail. They can't help themselves. Give me 18 months. He spent the next 18 months tracing every thread. He followed the paper trail of the shell accounts that had been used to receive the duplex proceeds, tracking them through a series of LLCs registered in Nevada and Delaware, until the money surfaced as a large cash down payment on a property in Colorado. He found the quitclaim deed on file in the county records, with the forged signature and the notary block. He pulled Kelly's licensing records and discovered that she had lost her Arizona real estate broker's license years ago due to a misrepresentation complaint that I had not even known about. He built a dossier that was thicker than a phone book, and on a morning in early March, he called me with an address. Jason and Kelly were living in a town called Summit Ridge, Colorado, a wealthy exurb of Denver nestled against the foothills, in a 4-bedroom, 3-bath colonial revival house with a covered front porch, a finished basement, and a 2-car garage. The house had been purchased 6 years earlier for $410,000, with a large cash down payment that traced back through the shell accounts to the $200,000 from the duplex sale. They had been living there ever since, under Kelly's maiden name, Brenner Trust, with Jason working sporadically as a rideshare driver, and Kelly still attempting to sell luxury homes despite the license revocation. Frank also gave me a printout of the county tax records, which showed that the property was encumbered with a ballooning adjustable-rate mortgage and a home equity line of credit that had been drawn down to the maximum. I got the address. I got the property records, and then I got a cheap prepaid smartphone and opened Facebook for the first time in 7 years. I created an account with no profile picture, just a grey silhouette, and I searched for Kelly's name. There it was on a public post from 3 months prior, a photo of the house with a caption that read, "So blessed to finally have our forever home. Hard work pays off." Underneath the photo, the location tag said Summit Ridge, and the comment section was full of heart emojis and congratulations from people who had no idea that the down payment for that forever home was stolen directly from a pensioner's last dime. I stared at that photo for about 10 minutes, my chest tight and my jaw aching from clenching, and then I called Patricia Okonkwo. "I found them," I said. "I need a forensic document examiner and a strategy. I'm going to get inside that house." The plan we built over the next 6 months was so detailed and so audacious that at times I felt like I was watching a movie about someone else. The first step was to secure the forensic opinion. Patricia located a document examiner named Dr. Angela Chen, a former FBI lab analyst who now ran a private practice in Denver. We shipped her the scans I had kept of the blank quitclaim form and the recorded forged deed. She spent 3 weeks examining the digital images under magnification, and she wrote a preliminary report. The report noted tracing artifacts. The signature on the deed was a near-perfect match to the one on an old birthday card I had provided as a known sample, but it showed inconsistent stroke pressure, multiple pen lifts where the forger had stopped and repositioned, and slight wavering that indicated a slow, deliberate tracing hand rather than a natural signer's muscle memory. Her conclusion was that the signature was highly indicative of simulation forgery, but she needed the original document to make a legally definitive finding. That original, I was certain, was somewhere in Jason and Kelly's house, because people who are stupid enough to commit such an amateur crime are also stupid enough to keep the evidence as a souvenir. They would think it was safe, tucked away in a filing cabinet, and they would never imagine that anyone would come looking. To get inside that house, I would have to become someone they would willingly invite in. I began to train. I grew out what remained of my hair into a short, soft grey bob, a style that made me look gentle and grandmotherly. I bought a pair of thick tortoiseshell glasses with clear, non-prescription lenses that softened the angles of my face. I practiced a new walk, a slightly slower, more hesitant gait that suggested a woman who had been kindly eroded by time rather than sharpened by fury. I bought clothes from Goodwill outlets, pastel cardigans, sensible beige walking shoes, blouses with small floral prints that buttoned to the neck. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a retired librarian with a mild expression and a fondness for chamomile tea. I practiced speaking in a slightly higher, more breathy voice, the kind of voice that made people want to offer you a seat on the bus. I could sustain it for hours without breaking character, and I recorded myself telling stories from a script I had written about my fake life until the words felt natural and unforced. I obtained a new driver's license and a matching social security card under the name Dorothy Marsh. This was not as difficult as it sounds. Frank had a contact, a sympathetic clerk in the state's division of motor vehicles, who was willing to look the other way for an elder fraud case when we explained the situation off the record. The contact issued a legitimate card with my photo but the new name, and Frank helped me fabricate a credit report that showed a spotless payment history and a modest income from a fictional pension. I built the cover story with layers of verifiable detail. Dorothy Marsh was a widowed school secretary from Bisbee, Arizona, who had just lost her condo to a scam contractor, had no living children, and was looking for a quiet, safe place to start over. I practiced the story until I could tell it in my sleep. Then I waited for an opening, and the opening came in the form of a next-door post from Kelly herself. My fake account, set up with a Summit Ridge address via a rented mailbox, showed me a neighborhood post. Room for rent. Beautiful furnished room in our 4BR home, $600/month, utilities included. Perfect for a quiet elderly lady or traveling nurse. Must be clean and respectful. The post had been up for 2 days with no takers. I applied immediately, sending a message full of gentle politeness and just enough loneliness to tug at the heartstrings of someone who thought they could exploit a vulnerable old woman. Kelly responded within 3 hours. We exchanged messages, then a phone call where I used my Dorothy voice, telling her about my recent troubles and how I just wanted a peaceful place to heal. She invited me to come see the room. 4 days later, wearing a lavender cardigan and carrying a quilted handbag I had bought at a thrift store, I stood on the front porch of the pale grey colonial and rang the doorbell. Kelly answered, and I looked her straight in the face for the first time in 7 years, my pulse slow and steady, and she saw only Dorothy. "You must be Mrs. Marsh," she said, holding out a manicured hand. "I'm Kelly. Please come in." I moved into the upstairs guest bedroom on a Saturday afternoon in early October. I brought 2 suitcases and a tote bag that held my real equipment, my portable scanner, a lockpick set disguised as a glasses repair kit, a tiny USB microphone disguised as a lipstick tube, and a burner phone with encrypted email. The bedroom was decorated in the same bland beige way that Kelly decorated everything. A duvet cover with a chevron pattern, a sign on the wall that said "Gather" in flowing cursive, a vase of fake eucalyptus on the nightstand that had gathered dust on its plastic leaves. I unpacked slowly, folding my cardigans and placing my sensible shoes in the closet, arranging my toiletries in the shared bathroom with the deliberate movements of someone who was in no hurry. I introduced myself to Jason that evening at dinner, a meal of overcooked rotisserie chicken and bagged salad that Kelly served on square plates she had probably seen in a catalogue. He looked at me with a flicker of something I could not quite name, a momentary furrow of the brow as if some deep part of his brain recognized a pattern it could not place. But the moment passed and he shook my hand with his usual loose, indifferent grip and said, "Nice to meet you, Dorothy. Welcome to our home." I smiled my soft Dorothy smile and said, "Thank you so much, this is just lovely." Inside my chest my heart was a tightly coiled spring. I learned within the first 3 days that Jason and Kelly were drowning financially. I had suspected as much from Frank's research, but the reality of it was worse than I had imagined. The mortgage on the house was an adjustable rate loan that had recently reset to a rate nearly double what they had originally expected, and the monthly payment had ballooned from $2,200 to just under $4,000. They had taken out a home equity line of credit to cover the gap when Kelly's real estate income evaporated, and that line was now maxed out. Jason was driving for a rideshare company, logging 12-hour days and coming home with a fake smile and a heavy slouch, his face pale with exhaustion. Kelly spent her days at the kitchen table, making frantic phone calls to credit card companies and debt consolidation services, her voice climbing into a shrill register that she could not quite keep out of the Dorothy areas of the house. They argued constantly, the arguments muffled but still audible through the thin walls, Kelly's voice sharp and accusatory, blaming Jason for not earning enough, Jason's voice a low defensive mutter about how she had been the one who insisted on the big house. One night, lying in my bed with the lights off, I heard Kelly say something that made my blood run cold. "We need that trust money, Jason," she hissed. "Your mother is the only one who can sign the release. We have to find her. We have to make her sign or we lose everything." I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding, and I realized that there was a piece of this puzzle I had not known about. Somewhere, Mike had set up a trust that required my signature to release, and they had been trying to access it for years. They had thrown me away, left me to rot in a rented studio, but they still needed me, and they did not even know I was sleeping in the room above their heads. The household accident that gave me my first real advantage happened on a Tuesday evening about 2 weeks into my stay. I was reading in my room, a boring romance novel I had bought for cover, when I heard Kelly scream from the kitchen downstairs, followed by the sound of water spraying at high pressure and the frantic clatter of parts falling. I hurried down the stairs and found chaos. The cold water supply line under the kitchen sink had burst, a clean split along the braided stainless steel hose, and water was fountaining directly onto the tile floor and soaking the base cabinets. Kelly was shrieking about the oak flooring and the custom wainscoting, her hands flapping uselessly. Jason was standing there with a dish towel, trying to hold it against the spray like a man trying to plug a bullet wound with a napkin, his face a mask of helpless panic. Water was pooling on the floor and seeping into the grout lines, and neither of them had the presence of mind to turn off the shut-off valve. I walked calmly past them, bent down under the sink, and cranked the oval-handled valve closed with a firm quarter turn. The water sputtered and stopped. They both stared at me open-mouthed as if I had performed a magic trick. I brushed off my hands and said in my soft Dorothy voice, "My late husband was a handyman. I picked up a thing or two." Then I went upstairs, retrieved the small toolkit I had brought with me, a canvas roll with a crescent wrench, a pair of adjustable pliers, and a few basic fittings, and came back down. I examined the burst supply line, saw that the braided steel had failed near the coupling, and told them I could replace it with a spare I had noticed in the laundry room. I had actually bought that spare line at the hardware store during my first week in Summit Ridge, because I had done an early walkthrough of the house while they were out, and noticed that the sink supply lines were original to the 1990s. I believed in being prepared. I swapped out the fitting, tightened it with the crescent wrench, and had the water back on in under 20 minutes while Kelly hovered behind me making sounds of helpless gratitude. That was the moment I fully transitioned in their minds from quiet old lady renter to useful quiet old lady renter. Kelly began to look at me with a sort of eager deference, the way a homeowner looks at a warranty that just kicked in. Jason started telling me about his problems, little complaints about work and money, testing to see if I was sympathetic. I was, to a point. I was also building my case. They started inviting me to eat dinner with them every night. They started confiding in me about small things, then larger things. One evening, over a glass of Barks Chardonnay that tasted like fermented fruit punch, Kelly leaned across the table and said, "You're so easy to talk to, Dorothy. You've seen so much of life." She told me they had a complicated family situation, that Jason's mother had lost her mind and allegedly cut them off, and that there was an inheritance tied up in a trust that required her signature. She did not mention the forgery or the theft, of course. She just painted a picture of a cruel, unstable elderly woman who had abandoned her loving son out of irrational spite. I nodded sympathetically, made soothing noises, and said, "Family can be so difficult. I had a cousin once who did something similar, and it broke my heart." Inside, I was filing every word away like evidence in a ledger. The home office was in the finished basement, a room with a Harlow-core door and a push-button privacy lock. I knew this because I had carefully scouted the house during the first week, mapping the layout and noting each door's locking mechanism. Push-button locks are trivially easy to defeat. I waited until a weekday afternoon when I knew they were both out, Jason driving his route and Kelly at an open house she was trying to host for a house she had no chance of selling. I went down to the basement with my glasses repair kit, which contained a small hook pick and a tension wrench tucked among the tiny screwdrivers. The lock gave way in under 15 seconds, the latch retracting with a soft click. Inside, the room was a mess of overflowing filing cabinets, stacked bankers' boxes, and a cheap composite desk with a dusty desktop computer. I did not touch the computer. I had no way of knowing what tracking software it might have, and a forensic search was beyond my amateur skills. What I was looking for was paper, because paper does not have a password. I started methodically working through the filing cabinets, starting with the top drawer of the nearest one. The drawers were disorganized, stuffed with old tax returns, credit card statements, real estate flyers, and expired insurance policies. I worked slowly, careful not to disturb the order of things, memorizing the position of each folder so I could replace it exactly. On my fourth visit, about 3 weeks into my stay, I found a hanging folder in the back of the bottom drawer of the oldest cabinet. It was labeled Duplex Transaction, in Kelly's rounded, bubbly handwriting, the kind with little circles over the eyes. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. Inside the folder was a stack of documents that made my heart beat so hard I could feel it in my temples. There was the original quitclaim deed dated 8 years ago, with my name signed at the bottom in blue ink that had faded just slightly. I held it up to the light and could see the telltale marks, the lettering uneven where their hand had shaken while tracing, the L in Laurie too wide, the Y in Massey ending in a scratch where the pen had caught. There was a notary acknowledgement page, signed and stamped by a notary named Deborah Lynch. I later learned, through Frank's investigation, that Deborah Lynch was Kelly's former college roommate and had since been stripped of her notary commission in 2 states for similar fraud. There was a wire transfer confirmation from an escrow company showing the disbursement of $200,000 to an account at a regional bank, with the account number clearly printed. And there was a purchase agreement for the Summit Ridge house, listing the source of the down payment as a gift from family, with a letter signed by Jason claiming the funds were a non-taxable inheritance from his deceased father Mike. That lie hit me like a physical blow. They had not only stolen from me, they had used my dead husband's name as a cover. I sat on the cold basement floor and took deep, measured breaths until my vision cleared. Then I pulled out my scanner, a flatbed portable model no bigger than a hardcover book, and I scanned every single page, front and back, at 600 dots per inch. I uploaded the scans to my encrypted cloud storage using the burner phone, which had a secure VPN connection, and I checked that the files had transferred completely before moving on. I carefully replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, aligning the tab with the others, and I lockpicked the door shut again, resetting the push-button lock. I went upstairs, made myself a cup of peppermint tea, and sat in the living room looking out at the quiet suburban street, planning the next move. The trap I was setting was almost complete. The ally I had been cultivating in the background for over a year was not a police officer or a private citizen, but a banking fraud investigator named Marcus Webb. Marcus worked in the financial crimes unit of the regional bank, where Jason and Kelly had opened the account that received the duplex proceeds. He was a tall, quiet man in his 40s, with a shaved head, and the calm, intense focus of someone who had spent his career chasing down elder financial abuse, mortgage fraud, and money laundering. Frank Morneau had connected us during the early days of the investigation, knowing that the bank's internal compliance system might flag the suspicious transaction history. Marcus had been alerted to my case by Frank's quiet network of retired law enforcement contacts, and he had agreed to work with me off the record, as long as I could provide him with the evidence he needed to open an official investigation. Over the months, I had been feeding him information in encrypted messages, the property records, the notary fraud details, the shell account connections. Now I had the keystone, the original forged deed, the notary fraud confirmation, and the direct chain of money from my stolen pension to their current home. I sent Marcus a message that evening from a coffee shop Wi-Fi using my burner phone, summarizing what I had found. His reply came within the hour. "This is airtight. But I need a recorded confession to lock it down. If you can get them to admit the fraud on tape, the CBI can move immediately." I told him I had an idea, and I asked him to reach out to a contact at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Elder Fraud Task Force to be ready to move when I gave the signal. I also asked him to look into the trust situation. What was this asset that required my signature? What Marcus found, after a few weeks of quiet digging, made me cry harder than I had cried since the night I found Mike's note. Years ago, after his cancer diagnosis, Mike had taken a small life insurance payout he had received from a separate union policy and placed it into a revocable living trust. The trust was modest, about $80,000 by the time fees had accumulated, but it had a very specific and unusual trigger clause. The trust could be liquidated, and the proceeds released only if a named beneficiary, me, appeared in person at the issuing bank and signed a notarized release. No power of attorney, no surrogate signature, no court order could override it. Mike had set this up as a last-ditch safety net, a dead man's switch, because he had a suspicion that Jason and Kelly would try to clean me out after he was gone, and he wanted to create an asset that would be useless to them without my physical, conscious, willing presence. I had never known about this trust. Mike had kept it secret, probably intending to tell me if things ever got desperate, but dying before he could. Jason and Kelly had learned about it somehow, probably from a stray letter from the bank that arrived at the duplex before they vanished, and they had been battering themselves against it for years, trying to get the money, because they needed it desperately and could not access it without the woman they had thrown away. The cruel irony was staggering. They had stolen my home to buy their dream, and the one thing that could save them from the mortgage nightmare they had created was tied to my existence. With Marcus's help, I began to construct a plan that would use that trust as bait. He would contact Jason, posing as a senior trust officer from the bank, and inform him that new documentation had been discovered that might allow the trust to be liquidated if an elderly female relative could be produced to sign in the presence of the bank's notary. Jason, vibrating with the prospect of $80,000 that would save his house from foreclosure, would have no choice but to find a way to produce someone who could plausibly pass for his mother. And I, Dorothy, the quiet old renter, was right there. Before I pulled the trigger on the plan, I needed to know with absolute certainty that there was nothing left in me that could waver. I had been living in their house for nearly 2 months, sharing meals, listening to Jason's tired stories, watching Kelly paint her nails at the kitchen table while she talked about her dreams of a real estate empire. A tiny, weak part of me, the part that was still Laurie the mother, had started to wonder. Maybe Jason had been coerced by Kelly. Maybe he was a victim too, trapped in a marriage with a manipulative woman who had led him astray. Maybe there was still something left to salvage. I decided to test them with the most honest thing I could think of, my own mortality. I staged a medical episode. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I knew they were both home, Jason taking a rare afternoon off between rideshare shifts and Kelly scrolling on her phone in the living room. I walked slowly to the bottom of the stairs, waited until I heard their voices, and then I collapsed dramatically. I flung my arm out as I fell, knocking over a small side table that held a decorative lamp. The lamp shattered loudly on the hardwood floor, a burst of ceramic and glass. I lay there on my side, one hand clutched to my chest, breathing in shallow, uneven gasps that I had practiced in the mirror for a week. I moaned in my Dorothy voice, but strained and breathless. "Help me, please, I can't breathe." I heard footsteps on the stairs. Jason appeared first, his face cycling from surprise to something that was not quite concern, more like the wary expression of a man who has just seen an inconvenient problem appear in his path. He crouched down a few feet away from me, but he did not reach for his phone. He just looked at me, then looked behind him toward the kitchen where Kelly was coming. Kelly appeared in the hallway, her phone in one hand, a look of mild irritation on her face. She looked at me crumpled on the floor, and her first words were not "Are you okay?" or "I'm calling an ambulance." Her first words were, "Oh my God, is she dying?" And then she stepped over my legs, literally stepped over my body as if I were a rug that had bunched up, and walked to the hallway thermostat. I heard her mutter, "Jason, go check her room, see if she left any emergency contact numbers. I'll call if I have to. I don't want to call paramedics for nothing and have them track mud on the floors." Jason turned and went upstairs without another glance at me. I lay there, still gasping, while I heard Kelly in the hallway, not dialing, but tapping on her phone and muttering something about how inconvenient it would be if I croaked before the end of the month, because she had budgeted my rent payment for the next credit card cycle. She said, "If the old bat dies, we're out $600 and we'll have to find another renter." This is so like her. I closed my eyes and let my breathing slow, and when Jason came back down and said, "There's nothing in her room except old lady stuff and some medicine," Kelly finally, reluctantly, pulled out her phone and dialed 911. She did not kneel down. She did not put a hand on my shoulder or say a comforting word. She just stood there, tapping her foot, and gave the address in a bored, flat voice. The paramedics came, checked my vitals, said it might have been a vagal episode, advised me to rest. I thanked them with a quivering voice, and when they were gone, I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed. The last molecule of maternal instinct inside me evaporated like water on asphalt in August. There was nothing left to doubt. These people would let me die if my death was convenient, and they would never, ever feel a moment of genuine regret about it. I gave the signal to Marcus that night. The plan we had built was elegant and simple, and leaned hard on their desperation. Marcus, using his official bank phone number but a carefully scripted persona, called Jason the next morning. I listened from the top of the stairs as Jason answered, his voice wary at first, then suddenly eager. Marcus told him that a recent audit of the trust had uncovered a loophole. If the bank could verify that the beneficiary was still alive, and that a close female relative could be presented as a designated agent, the trust could be liquidated without the beneficiary's personal appearance, as long as the relative signed in the presence of a bank notary. Jason, his voice cracking with excitement, asked what kind of relative. Marcus said, "An elderly female with a plausible connection to the grantor. A sister, a cousin, a family friend. The bank just needs a warm body to sign, really." Jason hung up and immediately told Kelly the news. I heard him say, "We can use Dorothy. She looks old enough, nobody will question it. We'll tell her it's a legal witness thing, she's too confused to know the difference." Kelly's voice was an eager squeal of relief. The appointment was set for 10:00 6:00 a.m. on a Wednesday at the Summit Ridge branch of the regional bank, the same branch Marcus worked out of. The morning of the confrontation was cold and bright, the Colorado sky a hard, clean blue that felt like it was marking the ugliness of what was about to happen. I dressed in my usual Dorothy uniform, a lavender cardigan and sensible beige walking shoes, and I tucked a small digital audio recorder into the inner pocket of my purse. The recorder was wired to a lapel mic clipped to my collar, and I tested it 3 times before leaving my room. I had a second backup recorder in my bra, just in case. I let Jason drive me to the bank, sitting in the back seat of his dusty sedan while Kelly rode shotgun and reviewed a manila folder of papers she had prepared. She was muttering about how easy this was going to be, how they'd have the mortgage paid off by the end of the week, and she could finally buy that new sofa she had been eyeing. Jason's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was nervous but not guilty, just nervous about whether his scheme would work. We parked in the bank lot, and I shuffled inside behind them, leaning on a cane I had bought specifically for this moment to complete the picture of frailty. The branch manager, a woman named Simone who had been fully briefed by Marcus and the CBI, greeted us with professional warmth and led us to a private conference room with a heavy oak table and a notary seal sitting visibly on a side table. The room was already occupied by 3 people I recognized from the evidence packets I had sent: 2 plainclothes investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Elder Fraud Task Force, a man and a woman in dark suits, and Marcus Webb himself, holding a leather portfolio. Simone closed the door behind us and I heard the lock click. The air in the room went very still. Jason looked around, his brow furrowing. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice suddenly small. Kelly's smile froze on her face. I reached up, removed my tortoiseshell glasses and set them on the table. I reached up to my hairline and pulled off the grey wig, revealing my close-cropped silver hair underneath. I stood straighter, letting the stoop fall away from my shoulders, and I looked my son directly in his eyes for the first time in 7 years without a disguise separating us. "Hello, Jason," I said in my own voice, the voice that had read him bedtime stories and signed his permission slips and liquidated her entire pension to buy him a future he burned on a bonfire of entitlement. His face went through 3 stages in 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then a plummeting, bloodless horror that is the only appropriate reaction when you realize you have been living with the woman you stole from, and she has been documenting every moment of your unraveling. He made a sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Kelly let out a noise like a stepped-on cat and lurched for the door, but the female investigator stepped smoothly into her path and took her by the arm. Within 30 seconds, both Jason and Kelly were in handcuffs. "Read their rights from a small card," the male investigator produced, and seated in heavy chairs on opposite sides of the table. I did not scream, I did not cry. I just looked at my son sitting there with his wrists bound and said very quietly, "You shouldn't have stepped over me." The notary seal sat unused on the side table, a detail that felt like a punchline nobody needed to explain. I gave the investigators everything: the scans of the forged quitclaim deed, the notary fraud documentation, the wire transfer records linking the duplex proceeds to the Summit Ridge house, and the audio recording of Kelly stepping over my body while I lay gasping on the floor. I also handed over a written statement that took me 3 days to compose, because I wanted every single fact to be footed and cross-checked, just like a payroll ledger. The criminal case took 9 months to prosecute, but the evidence was so overwhelming that the defense had almost no room to maneuver. The forensic document examiner, Dr. Chen, examined the original deed after the CBI seized it from Jason and Kelly's filing cabinet, and her final report confirmed the forgery with absolute certainty. The notary Deborah Lynch was also investigated and charged, and she eventually cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Jason pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony fraud and 1 count of elder abuse in the 1st degree, receiving a sentence of 7 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, with a 5-year term of parole after. Kelly pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and felony elder exploitation, and she received 5 years, along with an order to pay restitution and a permanent ban from ever holding a real estate license again. At the sentencing hearing, I read a victim impact statement that I had scribbled on the same blue graph paper I used for my budgets. I did not yell. I simply described what it felt like to be erased by your own child, and to have to claw your way back with nothing but a set of lockpicks and a burning refusal to stay invisible. The civil judgment was a separate and quieter victory. Patricia Okonkwo had filed the lawsuit under seal the very month before I moved into the Summit Ridge house, and it rested on the same mountain of evidence. The court found that the entire Summit Ridge property had been purchased with the direct proceeds of fraud, and it was ordered sold at a sheriff's auction, with the proceeds to satisfy my judgment. By that time, my judgment included not just the original $175,000 I had been cheated out of, but also $89,000 in statutory interest calculated at the Arizona legal rate, $32,000 in legal fees and court costs, and $44,000 in punitive damages for the extreme nature of the elder exploitation. The total came to just over $340,000. At the sheriff's auction, I was the only bidder because Patricia had structured the judgment in a way that allowed me to use the judgment itself as a credit bid. I did not have to put up a single dollar of cash. I simply raised my paddle and the auctioneer said, "Sold to the lien holder." A week later, I stood on the front porch of the pale grey Colonial, the writ of foreclosure in my handbag and the keys in my hand. The front door was open, and the house was empty except for a few pieces of furniture the bank had not bothered to seize. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the oak flooring, and I stopped in the basement office where I had found the evidence that sealed their fate. The filing cabinet was gone, taken as evidence, but the faint outline of it was still visible on the worn carpet. I stood there for a long time, not feeling triumph exactly, but something quieter and more permanent. It was the feeling of a ledger balancing at last. I hired a contractor to renovate the house. The whole place needed work, because Jason and Kelly had let maintenance slide in their financial desperation. I had the basement converted into a separate lark-off unit with its own kitchenette and entrance, so the house could be rented as 2 independent spaces. I put in a hot tub on the back deck, because I had decided that my retirement was going to include a hot tub, and a fire pit in the backyard surrounded by comfortable Adirondack chairs. I repainted the front door a deep, warm red, because I was done with pale grey. The house now operates as a short-term vacation rental, managed by a local property company that handles the bookings and the cleaning and the guests who occasionally lark themselves out. I call it the Laughlin House after my maiden name, because that is the name I reclaimed the day I stopped being Dorothy Marsh and started being the woman Mike always knew I was. It books consistently at a rate of $270 a night, with a 90% occupancy rate year-round, because Summit Ridge is a destination for mountain bikers in the summer, skiers in the winter, and wealthy couples in the in-between months who want to pretend they are in a Hallmark movie. After taxes and property management fees, the rental income averages just over $4,000 a month, which is more than I ever earned in my best year as a payroll clerk. I live in a small cottage about 20 minutes away, a place I own outright, and paid for with a small portion of the settlement, with a workshop in the garage where I keep Mike's old tools. On the workbench, I have a single photograph of him, the one from the photo booth strip where he is making a ridiculous face. I have a retirement that is actually restful, a quiet rhythm of morning coffee and afternoon walks, and the occasional drive up to the house to check on the property manager. I have finally stopped waking up at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding because I am afraid I have run out of money. And I keep Mike's note framed on my dresser, the 16 words that I ignored and then remembered, the warning that became a blueprint. He saw the rot long before I could accept it, and he loved me enough to leave me a signpost. I just needed to learn how to read it. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely, someone who was supposed to love you, and found yourself standing in the wreckage not knowing whether to grieve the person you lost or the person you thought they were? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and your story might help someone else who is still holding on to hope that the vultures will eventually learn to sing. If you believe that integrity is not a family inheritance but a daily choice, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories coming, and the people who try to steal from the ones who love them always make the same mistake. They underestimate the quiet ones. I'll see you in the next one.